Welcome to Short Story Theater. They say, bad luck will be yours, if you let a genie out of the bottle. But what about the Jack in the Box? What would happen if you were to release Jack from his box? That's a question you can ponder as you listen to Bill Russo's chilling tale, which is indeed called The Jack in the Box. The tale will be told by a man, soon to retire, after 40 years on the same job. Now here's our story.
They have rented the American Legion Hall up in Caribou for my retirement party. About 100 drivers and company executives will be at the event. 40 years ago, when I started as a dispatcher for the L&L Trucking Company in northern Maine, it didn't look like I was going to last 40 days, let alone 40 years. There's a good reason why I almost left the trucking business in only my third week on the job, and there are still a few old-timers who know about it. But none of the newer people have heard the story, so I'm going to tell it on Saturday night. It will be the major part of my going-away speech. Since you're not going to be in the Legion Hall this weekend, I'll tell it to you right now, but if you see any of the L&L drivers, don't spoil my talk by sharing this tale. I want them to hear it from me, firsthand. I was a northern Maine boy, born and raised. In fact, I never had been out of Aroostook County at the top of the state, until after a few years at the L&L Trucking Company. Every once in a while, I went along with some of the long-haul drivers to places like Boston, New York City, and Pennsylvania. Like most of the county boys and girls, I grew up picking potatoes. My first harvest was as a 7-year-old, and every year, all the way through the 12th grade, I was a potato picker. Up in Aroostook County back then, all the harvesting was done by hand, and all hands were needed. The schools shut down around the third week of September. They called it potato recess. And we loved it. For the next 3 to 4 weeks, almost everybody in town, young and old, was a picker. You could be working in a field with your own grandpa and grandmother. We got transported to the fields before dawn and worked until dusk. Trailing behind a digger machine, it was our job to pick up the spuds from the muddy fields and put them in large barrels. Everybody got the same pay, 10 cents a barrel, back when I first started. The difference was that a really good picker can fill at least 100 barrels, while the young kids are lucky if they can manage 20. It was a 7-day-a-week job, though on Sunday, many people took a little time off for church. After I got out of high school, I drifted around a little bit before landing a job at the paper mill up in Madawaska, at the very top of Maine. I stayed there about 5 years and I planned to work there my whole life. But then I saw an ad, in the St. John Valley newspaper. It was for a third-shift dispatcher at the L&L Trucking Company. The L&L in the name meant that the company did both local and long-haul deliveries. The newspaper ad said that the dispatcher would be responsible for supervising the loading dock, as well as manifesting the contents of trailers, and entering information on their newly installed computer system. It stressed that no experience was needed, and the only ability required was that the applicant be able to stay awake on the job. I'd always been kind of a night owl anyway, and since I had no experience, which is what they were looking for, I figured I might as well give it a shot. The very next morning, I drove my Plymouth Straight 6, down Route 95. About 80 miles or so to the trucking terminal. A sprawling one-story brick building, it was sitting all by itself, on top a hill so high, I wondered how the trucks could make it up and down the grade in the dead of winter. Parking the old Plymouth in a space marked for visitors, I went inside the office, a small building connected to a much larger structure that seemed almost as big as a football field. I learned later that it was the truck dock, and it was flanked on either side by 8 large roll-up doors that the box trailers lined up with, to load or unload freight. An enthusiastic middle-aged man greeted me warmly and led me to his office where he explained the basics of the job, and in less than 10 minutes, he asked me if I'd take it. Since the money was twice what I was making at the paper mill, I wanted to accept right away. But something made me hesitate, and wonder why they were so eager to hire the first person who walked in off the street. I decided to ask a question, which was simply, what happened to the last dispatcher? He told me that they were having trouble getting anyone who could handle the third shift. The job was from midnight to 8 a.m. and several times he arrived at the office at 6 or 7 in the morning, only to find the dispatcher sound asleep. We can't have anybody sleeping on the job. The person has to be able to stay awake for the full shift, he said. I assured him that I could easily manage that. I accepted the job and was told I could start right away. That afternoon I gave my notice at the old job and 2 weeks later, reported for my first shift at the truck terminal. The manager, Roland Daigle, gave me a tour of the facilities, which consisted of the office, the loading dock, and a massive parking lot where, on any given day, as many as 50 to 100 trailers might be parked. We handle thousands of truckloads of potatoes in season, Mr. Daigle told me. Plus we are the #1 carrier for the paper mill on the St. John River. In addition, we carry all the freight of the Jade East Cologne Company. We do pickup and delivery in 35 towns in the area, with a crew of 8 local drivers. And on top of that, we dispatch anywhere from 5 to 20 long-haul trucks each night during the busy season. Your job, he told me, will involve keeping an eye on the dock. The men work very well on their own, and we never have a problem. You just have to look in on them every now and then. You won't have to worry about this too much, because the dock workers will usually be finished with their work by the time you get here, though occasionally they do have to work a bit past midnight. Your other jobs include checking in any line haul drivers who might arrive, as well as entering into the computer the manifest information for each trailer load that gets filled up by the workers on the dock. Like I said, when it's busy, we dispatch 5 or more trailers every night. Each box truck will have anywhere from 1 item on it, in the case of very large things like oil well valves, or hundreds of items, such as in a trailer of mixed freight. In the beginning it may take you a bit of time to type out the manifest, but after a few weeks, you'll be able to do one in about 20 minutes. He was right. By the end of my second week, I had the job down so well that my work was generally done by 3 a.m., and that meant I had nothing to do for the final 5 hours of my shift. Luckily that was not a problem. I had 3 things that kept me going. First was books. I love reading and spend at least 2 hours a night working on the latest Louis L'Amour Western, or something spooky from Stephen King. Then there was the radio. Northern Maine is notorious for poor radio and television reception, but there was something about our location, on Haynesville Mountain, that made for great listening. Most nights I could get WBZ out of Boston, and even WPTR from upstate New York. I also was able to pick up Montreal and even Toronto. The third thing that kept me going was coffee. Lots of it, with milk but no sugar. The job was ideal. The boss liked me, the workers liked me, and I was getting twice as much money as I made at the paper mill. What could go wrong? The answer to that question came on the very first night of my 3rd week on the job. It was a cold January night with the temperature around 0. A bitter wind racing down from New Brunswick plunged the wind chill factor down to 30 below. It being the wintertime lull, the dock workers were finished with their work long before I arrived. I looked at the schedule, and saw that no loads were coming in and no loads were going out. I would have nothing to do for my whole shift, and wouldn't see a single person until the drivers began arriving between 6 and 7 in the morning. Not to worry. I had a copy of Stephen King's new book, Dead Zone, to keep me company, as well as an endless supply of Maxwell House from the company pot. After spending an hour tidying up the office and catching up on paperwork, I went out to check the dock. It was extremely cold. I wondered if the guys would be able to do their work in the morning. We didn't have heat on the docks back then, but both the union and the company agreed that if the temperature in the dock area was below 15 degrees, the men did not have to work until space heaters got the temperature up, or the sun came out and moderated the frigid weather. I walked down the left side of the building first, that's the side which hosted the long-haul trailers. Backed into each of the 8 doors were boxed trailers, 45 feet long and 8 feet wide, some full, some partially loaded, and a couple empties. There were a few dozen pallets of freight on the floor of the dock, but the place was pretty barren, due to the normal mid-January slowdown. All of the trailer doors were open except for the very last in line. The door on that box was shut and there was a metal seal on the handle, signifying that the trailer was fully loaded and ready for dispatch. I went back in the office and double-checked the manifests. There were 2 full trailers listed and both were inbound, meaning that they were full of freight that would be unloaded and delivered in the local area. 5 partial outbound trailers were listed. They were boxes that were in the process of being loaded for long hauls to Boston, New Jersey, or a freight consolidation center the company operated in Pennsylvania. Doing a quick yard check to make sure everything was in order, I noticed that the wind, already howling, was increasing, and it was starting to snow. Back inside, I started the Maxwell House going in the coffee pot, and then turned on the radio in hopes of getting the latest weather forecast. There was a loud bang at the end of the freight dock by the last trailer. The lights went out. I took a flashlight and walked the dock. Somehow, a pallet of heavy auto parts had fallen over right in front of the last trailer, the one with the seal and the closed door. Another yard check failed to indicate any reason for the power outage. Obviously wires were down somewhere, but the ones leading into the freight terminal were still intact. With the weather conditions nearing blizzard proportions, I was forced to go back inside. I sat in the office in total darkness. The flashlight really wouldn't be enough for me to read the dead zone, but even worse than that, the power went out before the coffee was made. It was getting cold. I couldn't believe how fast the temperature dropped in the tiny freight office. Again I went outside to check on the conditions and found that a foot of snow had fallen in little more than an hour. The icy wind screamed as it sliced through the cracks between the box trailers and the overhead doors. The howling of the wind got so loud that I barely heard a knocking sound coming from somewhere on the dock. When the wind died down, the knocking got louder. Taking the flashlight I left the office and went out to the adjoining dock. The noise was coming from the last box on the left. But the last box on the left was an empty trailer. At least it was supposed to be. I thought of calling my boss. Maybe they loaded some animals into the trailer, for some reason. Maybe the noise was coming from a polar bear, who would not be affected by sub-zero weather. Maybe, but I didn't think so. And I couldn't call my boss, Roland Daigle, because the phones were down, along with the electrical power. As I was thinking all this, I stood on the dock, holding the flashlight. Surrounded by total darkness, and the knocking on the door of a supposedly empty trailer. I fled back to the office in fear. What could be in the last box on the left? My hands were nearly frozen to the flashlight. I set it on my desk, a thin plume of light barely reached the ceiling. My gloves were on the desk. I put them on and moved my fingers back and forth rapidly a few dozen times, trying to warm them up. The knocking stopped. I waited 5 minutes, and still there was no noise, other than the wailing of the Canada wind, roaring down the St. John River, and smashing into the brick walls of the freight terminal with the ferocity of a hurricane. The wind. That was it. It was the wind that made the knocking noise. My hands felt better now, snuggled inside the fur-lined gloves. Sitting in my heavily padded, executive office chair, I felt secure and relaxed in the comparative warmth of the office. I didn't wish to go back on the dock, at least not till daylight, or the power came back on, whichever came first. But then the knocking started again. At first it was lethargic and slow but soon picked up in volume and frequency. It wasn't the wind. There was something alive, in that trailer. Something alive, but maybe not. Perhaps it was a battery-operated machine, that somehow got activated, and it was peppering the door of the trailer. Maybe the battery will run down. I'll wait a few minutes. I don't know how long I waited, but the battery didn't die down. The knocking was even more insistent than before. Whatever it is, I've got to go back on the dock. Maybe somebody got locked in the trailer, God forbid. If that's what happened, I can't leave him out there to freeze. I decided to go back on the dock, and open the trailer door, no matter what was inside. As I left the office, I grabbed a ball-peen hammer from the maintenance closet, in case I had to deal with an enraged animal. Walking onto the dock, I closed the office door behind me, and stepped slowly, past the first and second trailers. At the third trailer, I picked up my pace. As a warrior going into a battle, I raced towards the last box on the left, adrenaline powering me, where reason would not. The knocking now was still louder than before. It was a frantic rapping, as if from someone, or something, who is hopelessly trapped in the locked trailer. Smashing the seal with the hammer, I flung up the door, and prepared to fight for my life. The door slid noisily up. I shined the flashlight on the floor, from the end of the box, to the front. There was nothing there. Maybe it was a flying thing. I shined the flashlight up the side walls, and along the ceiling of the trailer. There was nothing there. Then, I heard a sound coming from the front of the box. It grew louder as it got near me. It sounded like air, being slowly released from a balloon. Louder now, the rushing air passed by me, I felt it on my face, as it went by. As the blast of air reached the dock, it dissipated. The howling of the wind subsided. It seemed like the temperature jumped 20 degrees, in an instant. All was quiet. I went back into the office. The lights came on, my Maxwell House finished brewing in the pot, the radio came on. And I collapsed in my chair. I stayed there, in a daze, until 6 a.m. when aroused by Roland Daigle, my boss. When I explained to him what happened, He was not surprised. He said, "It was Jack. It was Jack in the Box." "What do you mean Jack in the Box?" I asked him. He said, "Well, Jack in the Box is the reason we haven't been able to keep anybody on the third shift. 3 years ago, the third shift dispatcher was in a hurry to leave work. I guess he had a hot date or something. It was the dead of winter, a night pretty much like last night. The dispatcher went out on the dock and locked down 3 trailers that were supposed to be loaded for the morning. But one of those trailers was still being loaded by poor Jack Fisher, who got locked inside, when the dispatcher failed to see him. Jack struggled to escape the locked box, but died overnight from exposure in temperatures of 20 below zero. Jack's ghost has been haunting us ever since. You're the first man who ever actually went out on the dock and opened the trailer door. All the others have just run off in fear. Well, that's my story. After I let the spirit of Jack out of the box, he didn't haunt the terminal anymore. And for the next 45 years, I worked the third shift and I never saw him again, or heard the unearthly knocking from the last box on the left. The one with Jack in the Box."
Thanks for listening. This is your host Basil, wondering about the genie in the bottle. Beware, because if you let a genie out of the bottle, bad things can happen. But as we heard today, in Bill Russo's short thriller, if you release the spirit of a Jack in the Box, you'll have good luck your whole life. No more for today, my friends, but please, if you like this story, share it, hit the like button, subscribe, and, most importantly of all, please come back again soon. Won't you?